Bom dia a todos. Gostava de cumprimentar o Sr. Vice-Reitor, meu amigo Paulo Villarreal, cumprimentar todos os presentes, os promotores da conferência, do projeto e autarcas presentes, e como foi pedido, apresentarei em inglês. As requested, I will switch to English now. I have a couple of messages that I believe could be important for your project, and as well to explain what's the approach that we have adopted regarding mobility. It's important to recall this idea that the mobility of people and the transport of freight is critical to wealth generation. It's absolutely critical. But more than that, it's quite important for people to access opportunities through transportation, through the transportation model as we know it, as it exists now, with all its problems. Billions of people manage to access new opportunities, education, culture, jobs, and so forth. So I believe that it's fair to say that we should be proud of what we have achieved during last century regarding mobility. What is a fact is that this mobility system generates externalities, actually negative externalities. And the problem here is, how do we cope with these externalities? Typically, due to our current model of mobility, we have a main first externality, that is air quality and greenhouse gas emissions. Then we have road safety, traffic congestion, and then still, when there is poor access, this generates inequalities. So these are the topics and these are the challenges that we have now. In addition to this, the mobility needs, mobility patterns of modern life have changed a lot. The amount of trips that are not regular, that are random due to our way of life, has increased a lot. In the old times, we used to drive from home to work and back, and that's it. Now you have to drive your children to school, we have to go to work, we have a meeting anywhere, we go for sports and this and that, and this generates new needs and generates a certain randomness in the mobility patterns. So supply has to somehow give an answer to this new sort of demand. The general challenge now is this. I mean, how do we face an increasing demand, because the demand for mobility will not decrease in Portugal, will not decrease in Europe, will not decrease in the world. We believe that by 2050, between 2 and 3 billion people will move from rural zones to urban zones. And this means that they will adopt, in the end of the day, mobility patterns the way we have now. And this means an dramatically extra demand for transportation. So we have to face this. And simultaneously, we have to manage and to mitigate the negative externalities of our mobility system. This means, for instance, globally, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to levels that are compatible with what we need to deliver on the targets of the Paris Agreement. Currently, worldwide, the emissions related to transport, the greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 emissions equivalent related to transport, are more or less 8 gigatons per year. In a business as usual scenario, we will arrive to 14 to 16 gigatons. But the level by 2050, but the level we need to deliver on the Paris Agreement by 2050 should be 2 to 3 gigatons. So we have almost 15, 16 gigatons in a business as usual scenario, and we need to come to 2 to 3 gigatons. These are real and global challenges. I mean, how do we do this? I think we should agree on principles, and we should agree on long-term objectives. The first principle is this: we have to focus on access. It's important to understand that the mobility is an instrument. But mobility is not an end in itself. It's an instrument to access opportunities. So focus on access on mobility. And access on mobility is not the same as ownership of mobility. The second principle is we should absolutely take advantage on the innovations that are coming. We know that the first one is the digitalization. We know that there is this electrification of the powertrains. We know that there is autonomy, and we know that there is new models for sharing mobility. These are trends, and we should take advantage of them. About the long-term objectives, everybody agrees that before 2050 we should decarbonize, we should be carbon neutral. Portugal has this objective. The transportation sector has as well established the objective of before 2050 achieve the carbon neutrality, and about this everybody agrees. The problem is that while it is easy to agree on long-term objectives, it's not that easy to decide what we have to do tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, the year after this year. It's not easy to capture public support for short-term actions based on long-term objectives. That's why, from a government point of view, we always have to blend quick winners, let's say short-term decisions, policies and projects, with long-term policies. The title, let's say, of this session says something like this: in intelligent transport systems, science, from science to policy and from policy to real world. From my point of view, between policy and real world there is something called politics. And why is politics important for this? Because we agree on long-term objectives, but we, generally speaking, live in democracies, which means that we have elections every 4 years. And we always have to manage how to capture public support for short-term projects that somehow contribute to long-term objectives. This is the difficulty in this. What are we doing in the Portuguese government to somehow cope with these challenges and with these difficulties of blending long-term and short-term? We have mainly, regarding transportation and mobility, of course, 3 lines of action. The first one is we should avoid or reduce trips that are not necessary. There is still too many unnecessary trips that take place. How do we do this? We do this through the right and the sustainable urban planning. So we have somehow to articulate with the municipalities. And about this, and I will not be exhaustive, of course, but let's say the most emblematic policy project that we have started in Portugal in the last years was the so-called strategic urban plans, that for the first time in Portugal, when we had to evaluate the merit for the purpose of funding, for the first time, The main criterion was the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that could be avoided with these interventions in the city. We are talking about 785 million euros for 52 projects in Portugal, and the main focus of these projects were multi and intermodality, active modes, and the reduction, low emission zones in cities, and in the end of the day, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is to avoid trips, which means to avoid emissions. The second line of action is to shift trips to more sustainable modes, more efficient modes. How do we do this? Our central focus is with public transport. Of course, Portugal, the Portuguese state, not the municipalities. The municipalities spend another amount of money. But just the state, the central state, spends more than 100 million euros just supporting public transportation every year. There are fiscal measures. In Portugal, it's possible to reduce the VAT of the transportation titles. That's 6%. This is a fiscal measure that started last year. In some Portuguese cities, children can travel for free until they are 12 years old. And there is, a half-price policy for elders, for people that are over 65 years old. So these are important measures regarding how to shift to more sustainable modes. In addition to this strong investment in public transportation, we are creating new regulation for shared mobility. We believe that there is a strong opportunity in shared mobility. It's not that easy to change regulations in countries because, there are interests that defend the status quo. That's part of the game, we know that. But what we are doing now, actually, I put it in circulation within the government yesterday, in fact, a new legal diploma that will introduce the possibility of car sharing and bike sharing and the possibility of having fiscal incentives for car sharing and bike sharing. So this is what we are doing regarding that. I think that's a requirement so we can advance to the concept of mobility as a service, so we can start to tell people that if they want to drop their own car, if we want to reduce car ownership and cars that are 90% of the time stopped using space, using parking lots and so on, that they can have alternatives. This can only be done, creating conditions for the development of urban transport, of public transport, and as well enabling sharing models for mobility. And finally, the third line of action is the one that aims at improving the efficiency of vehicles and the efficiency of fuels or energy. And about this, we launched last year the Clean Bus initiative. Within this Clean Bus, public and private public transport operators have applied to renew their fleets. We are so far supporting the renewal of 516 new buses that should be either electric, in fact 79 of them are electric, or should run on natural gas. This is an investment of 156 million euro, supported by more than 50 million euro by public funds, and we will achieve, through this renewal of the bus fleet, a reduction of almost 5,000 tons of CO2 every year. The second project on this improvement of efficiency of vehicles and fuels is, of course, the national program for electric mobility. In Portugal, the people or companies that want to acquire electric vehicles have a strong support from the state. The package includes tax exemptions. It includes as well support, let's say, fund from from the government for each car that is bought and that runs on electricity. At the same time, we are expanding our charging network in Portugal. By the end of the year, we will have either fast or semi-fast chargers in every municipality of the country. This will be 1,600 charging points in this national charging electric vehicle charging network. And with this, we believe that combined with the fact that in Portugal 60% of the electricity consumed comes from renewable sources, means that we are actually contributing to decarbonize the transport sector. So, avoid, shift, improve. These are the 3 lines of action. We are developing either policies or policies and projects in each one of these 3 lines. I believe that what we are achieving is remarkable, and this is well demonstrated statistically. From 2015 to 2016, the growth of the passenger kilometers transported in Portugal was 10.5%. And if I consider the state-owned companies, transport operators, the growth is between 4 and 6%, either from 2015 to 2016 and from 2016 to 2017. So things are really moving. I believe that we need this transformation. I know that these days, the day before yesterday, I've been in a European Council, and one of the topics was the targets decided by the European, or proposed by the Commission, for the levels of emissions of new light cars and light vans. It is clear that the targets proposed, that are more or less a reduction of 25% in the emission factors by 2030, is not enough, is not ambitious enough. We know that there is, the car maker industry, there is a lot of interest, this is part of the game, the economy exists, and the economy typically is not very happy when disruptive changes are coming. But we have to deal with this. What we know is that, in what I believe, and we try to reflect it in the public policies in Portugal, is that in the very next years, there will be dramatic changes. In some cases, they will have to be disruptive, and this scenario that by 2050 we will not be able to decarbonize the transport system, in my view, most probably will not happen. Meaning that I believe that technology will make its role. There is, from the university side, from the research side, and I'm an academic as well, so I know what I'm talking about. There is a lot of investment regarding, batteries for electrification, regarding synthetic fuels, regarding negative emissions to compensate the residual emissions that will always exist in a transportation system. So I do believe that we will go in front and that we will make this transformation. This is an exercise, this is an effort that is not done by one single state, one single city, one single company. That's why Portugal, together with France and the Netherlands, launched recently the Transport Decarbonization Alliance, which is a front-runners alliance that puts together countries, cities, and companies, and that will try to raise the profile of transportation, of the transport sector, within the climate debate. We know that it was only possible to agree on the Paris Agreement because only states were at the table, the so-called parties. But now it's time for action. Time for action means that we have to work with cities and with companies, the ones that on the ground can change. And this is what we are doing with this alliance. I believe that by the end of the year we will have some more countries with us. We are doing this work now. Some more companies, global companies, that can share experiences, that can somehow advocate the need for the reduction, the strong, dramatic reduction on emissions, and this is the way we are doing. I mean, as I said, not alone, together with other states, cities, and companies. This is an overall effort. Pollution, greenhouse gas emissions have no border. They just happen. And the effects take place everywhere, in every geography, in every sector, and it has to do with all of us. So that's why we are doing this. And I mean, making use of my former profession as an academic, I try to explain this very well so people understand why we are using public money for this sort of policies and this sort of projects, because this is something that will happen in the very near future. People always agree about targets for 2050, 2070, because people think, okay, that's not going to be with me. It's too far away. But the child that goes today to primary school will retire in 2080, maybe 2085. So it's for our children. So it has to do with us for sure. Thank you very much.